Hey, this is Jun Shima. I'm a filmmaker and cinematographer, and I am also an assistant professor at the New School University in New York City. I'm currently based in Tokyo, Japan. These days, I work mostly on commercial and documentary films. I lived in Brooklyn, New York for 13 years and came back to Tokyo due to the pandemic. While I was there, I met Jamie and started working for Story Keep as a cinematographer. I had opportunity to travel to Minneapolis, New Orleans, Montreal, and all around New York State with Jamie to capture great family moments and interviews. One of my favorite projects was filming a family spanning four generations based in Brooklyn, from children to grandfather who emigrated to the United States from Europe in the 1920s. I've always been interested in generational stories. I felt so honored to be connecting those family dots into a huge collective of family history and memories. If this sounds interesting for your family or when you sport, be in touch with us.
Welcome to Who We Remember. I'm Jamie Younger, the founder of Story Keep and your host for this podcast. First, let me say how delighted I am to have you joining us for the show. This is a place where we have uncommon conversations about things that matter deeply, the people we love, and the purpose that we give to our own lives and legacies. Our mission at Story Keep is to capitalize on the power of story for profound good in families of wealth. Since 2010, we've partnered with over 100 families worldwide, creating personal films and private podcasts that help a family navigate their shared narrative. Our work is designed to deepen connections. My conversations on this podcast center on two questions. I ask each of my guests this: whose life story from your family would you most want to see documented on film? And then secondly, what are they, as a person and as a professional, hoping to create and leave behind? Today, I'm honored to welcome Matthew Fleming to the podcast. Matthew is a former British Army officer and England cricketer, and he served as the president of the prestigious Marylebone Cricket Club, often called the spiritual home of cricket. He is also a partner at Stonehage Fleming, one of the world's leading multifamily offices, helping families manage wealth and legacy across generations. Matthew is here to talk about his grandfather, Captain Michael Valentine Fleming. Born in 1913, Michael was the youngest of four brothers in a remarkable British family. One of his older brothers was Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond. Michael chose a path of military service. He served with distinction in World War II and was mentioned in dispatches 3 times for bravery. He was killed in action in France in 1940 at just 27 years old. At the time of his death, his son, Matthew's dad, was only 5. Though Matthew never knew his grandfather personally, the story of Michael's life and sacrifice has echoed through his family for generations. So please settle in. You're about to hear a remarkable story and meet a sage of our industry. This is Who We Remember. Let's dive in. Hi, Matthew. Thanks so much for joining me in this conversation about your grandfather.
Jamie, it's lovely to be here. It's the first chance I've really had to talk about him at any length, so it'll be fascinating to see where we get to, where it takes us.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to having you paint a picture. To get us going, can you introduce us to him, share his name, and I think it's also helpful the year he was born and where he was born to kind of create a context for the world he was born into.
Okay, so my grandfather was Michael Valentine Fleming, and I feel unnaturally close to him, A, because he was my grandfather, B, we share initials. I'm Matthew Valentine Fleming, and he is this mystical figure in my background, in my family. And he was born in 1913, 4 years before his father Valentine died in the First World War. So there's a sort of not knowing your father, your grandfather thing that is a theme through my family, but also many families, who lived through the 2 great conflicts. So yeah, that Michael Valentine, that's him. Oh, he was born in London, sorry.
born in London in 1913. And we were speaking earlier about how you don't actually know a ton about him, and that is why you would want to have had his life story documented.
Yeah.
What do you know about sort of the major turning points or, let's say, activities of what happened in his life?
Well, I mean, 2 or 3 main events in his life. I mean, firstly, obviously, the war, the Second World War, where he ultimately died of his injuries in a military hospital in Lille, having been injured in a village called Cassel on the retreat to Dunkirk. So that was a key part of his life. Secondly, was his marriage at a relatively young age to my grandmother, Letitia, that they had 4 children together before the age of 27. So his family obviously is key to me. And I guess thirdly is where he sits in the Flemingosphere. You know, my family, you know, his grandfather formed this great business from whom we still benefit now. His father was a giant of a man, an MP, whose obituary was written by Winston Churchill, you know, who died in the First World War. So he was already standing on the shoulders of giants, aged, you know, as a 3rd generation member of the family. And here I am as a 5th generation, standing on the shoulders of even more giants. So those are the 3 big things to me.
Yeah, indeed. And interesting about such a large figure, and as you say, sort of almost mythical in your mind, is when we think about the opportunity, had we had it, to sit with him and, let's say, make a film sitting with him, documenting his life story. What are you curious about now, with all that you know in hindsight, what you would want to ask him to share?
Well, I just need to contextualize it a little bit more. One thing I didn't mention there is his 3 siblings. He was the youngest of 4 boys. He had 3 older brothers. One was Ian Fleming, who wrote James Bond and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and was this extraordinary sort of mystical figure in MI6, a naval commander during the war, and played a key role in the area of espionage during the war. Then there was Peter Fleming, who was also in MI6, also played a key role in espionage. He was also an author, but his sort of genre was travel writing because he was actually an explorer. So one of my grandfather's older brothers was an author of the world's greatest spy franchise. One was a soldier and author and explorer, and he died on Black Mount up in Scotland, and there's a plinth where he died, which just says Peter Fleming, soldier, author, explorer. So you have 2 legends there. Then you have the other brother, Richard Fleming, who ran the business, Fleming's, and was hugely responsible for it growing the business it was when it was ultimately sold in 2000. So this is the youngest of 4 boys. His 3 older brothers were, I mean, genuine giants. And yet Michael was this really special youngest son. And I'd love to have understood more about him because, you know, my grandmother used to talk about him in such extraordinary terms that it was almost as if he was the special one of the 4. So, you know, what on earth could he have gone on to do? And, you know, what were the values that underpinned him and, you know, his perspective on life?
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I hope that we bring to families and this kind of opportunity, the thinking of this, is to bring our own curiosities and say, like, is this something that you would find like worthwhile, you know? And the question that's coming to me, and I don't know if it resonates with you, is asking him how he sort of felt about going off to war. Like, what was actually happening for him
Yeah.
as an individual, how he anticipated that. Did he, I can well imagine, think of it as duty, but what other thoughts were going on for him?
Yeah.
Is that something that crosses your mind?
Often. And, you know, the fact that in a very old-fashioned kind of way, his platoon, the one he commanded, was made up of men almost entirely from the family's estates. So he was surrounded by men he felt a deep connection to, not just in terms of the fact that he'd probably known some of them all of his life, but the fact that he felt a deep sense of duty to all their families, which he also probably must have known.
Mm-hmm.
So how did he that sense of pride of leading a platoon of men who you were so connected to, but also that deep sense of responsibility. Where did that fit in? It was obviously a different time. And obviously people's expectations post-war, post the First World War, there was a culture of going to war to defend your country was a thing.
Yes.
How did that feel, as you say?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What do you know from your grandmother about other aspects of his life that make you curious?
Well, just that he was this charming, decent, typical youngest brother. He was just a lovely, great man.
Hmm.
He never knew his children, really. He died, what was it? He died when he was 27. So my father was the eldest, would have known him for 5 years.
Yeah.
He didn't get a chance to build a relationship with us. And everything I take for granted, I've just become a grandfather, I'm about to become a grandfather again. All those things, those extraordinary emotions. I've walked a daughter down the aisle, I'm about to walk another daughter down the aisle. He didn't do all those things. And yet, because of him, I'm here.
Isn't that the incredible thing of it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, you said at the beginning, or you mentioned to me that we may talk about what I do now. To me, I can't separate what I do now from talking about previous generations of my family, because, my 60th birthday, Priyanka and the team in the family office gave me a T-shirt that just says "Standing on the Shoulders of Giants," because I say it so often, and I mean it. I genuinely mean it. We wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't for him and his brothers and previous generations of my family. So, I find it a duty to them, and fulfilling my personal ambitions are so intertwined that, I can't think of one without the other.
You can't pull them apart.
No.
Before we do move on to talking about your work today, just let's say as a creative brainstorm here, if we were to imagine that we had had the opportunity to be with your grandfather and we would have done an interview with him, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also creating other scenes, something that's illustrative of who he is, either having him sit and be in conversation with someone else or, something like putting his uniform on, right? If you're thinking filmically, you're thinking cinematically, what else could we capture of him? If you had a 30 seconds of frame of him doing something or being somewhere, what would be on your wish list?
I would like to be on the west coast of Scotland with him and with my father in the hills, walking and talking a bit, but a lot in silence. I would like to be, it's not a very politically correct thing, but stalking. It's a very important part of my family is managing a herd of deer in Scotland. And I have a feeling that's where he would have been, very peaceful. It's where my father was very peaceful and happy, and it's where I'm very peaceful and happy. So I'd like to be there with both of them. I'd like to hear them in conversation, not to ever be able to have a grown-up conversation with your dad or with your son must be, I never asked my father what he felt about that. I was with my father when he and his brother saw their father's grave for the first time. We went and tracked it down through the War Graves Commission, and I don't think either of them had wanted to go there for a while, but there was a time when it was right. And it was when 2 of my daughters came with me, so they must have been 12 and 10, or maybe all 3 came. It must have been 12, 10 and 8. So, we went out to see both my grandfather's grave and my great-grandfather's grave. And we used a military historian who brought with all the trench maps and the patrol reports. We got within 5 yards of where my great-grandfather was killed on the Somme, and within 5 yards of where my grandfather was shot and wounded in Cassel because he died of his wounds. So, we got, we achieved as much connectivity as we could without them there. I just would have loved the chance to achieve some connectivity with them there.
Yeah. One of the things I find so interesting about story is that values are embedded in it. And I'm curious what value or values, maybe there's a few, but maybe there's a key value that you feel he embodied that has been passed down to you either directly or indirectly.
That's easy. Duty.
Duty.
Hmm.
Say more.
Well, for some people, the word duty is a negative. It sort of crushes people because it sort of inhibits them having their own life. Yeah. Whereas for me, it's an unbelievably positive thing. Duty is really positive driver for me. So I was a soldier for 5 years. That was underpinned by a sense of duty. Country first. I was a sportsman for 12 years. I played for England and I captained my county, and there's a degree of duty there. Country, county, team, leadership. Now here I am at the business that still carries my family's name, and for me, there's an element of duty in that too, but it's a really positive element of duty. It's proudly representing rather than being an uninvited weight. So, both my great-grandfather and my grandfather and my father, who did national service, for them, duty was a huge thing. And my father worked for Fleming's for 55 years, duty personified to something greater than yourself. And that's what really motivates me. I like the leadership motto at Santas, the Royal Military Academy, where you go for officer training. The leadership motto is serve to lead. That for me, that's what my great-grandfather did, that's what my grandfather did, that's what my father did, and that's what I'm trying to do.
So given that being the really broad context of your work, can you talk about what you feel is really the core of your work?
So I wrote a letter to my father-in-law. I married an amazing lady called Caroline 36 years ago now. And we're still married, just to add to that. And I wrote a letter to her father shortly before he died saying, I wanted to thank him for everything he'd done for us and make sure he knew how appreciative we were. But I asked him a question in the letter, was it luck or good judgment that you end up marrying someone whose values so closely represent yourselves and into a family whose values so closely represent your own values? Well, I think the thing is, I've been incredibly lucky to be brought up in a family that was close and loving, married into a family that's close and loving, that remains cohesive and communicative. And, obviously we have our Achilles heels like every family. But I mean, for the most part, my family is a product of two loving families. And I hope my family is a loving family as a result. I assumed naively that every family was like that. And it turns out they're probably in the minority. And that business owning and wealthy families, however you perceive wealth, there's a layer of complexity over the already challenging dynamic of being a family. And I genuinely, out of good fortune, want other families to enjoy more of what I've had, more of what we've been lucky enough to have, and avoid pitfalls that are relatively easily avoided with one or two tools. So I help families think through their intergenerational strategies, think through how they engage with the next generation and vice versa, how they help the next generation think about success and failure and roles and responsibilities with family businesses and family wealth. And we help bridge the gap between the generations. And I do it because I love doing it. I love having conversations with families, with members of every generation, but also collectively. I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't enjoy it, but also because I know how lucky I've been. And it seems a small way of serving other people is to help them do that. It also means that I'm playing a role in my family business, and I'm carrying the flag for people like Michael, people like my father Valentine, and people like my great-grandfather Valentine. So there's a sort of combination of also, I'm not qualified to do anything else,
I know how you feel.
And it's meant I didn't have to go through a long interview process 20-something years ago when I stopped playing cricket.
If you could pinpoint the most meaningful part of your work, and I don't know if it comes down to a scene or a certain aspect of what you do, what to you, Matthew, personally, is the most meaningful part of the work that you do?
We uncork the bottle for families. I love that moment when the families realize that the cork's been taken out of the bottle. Whatever was the blockage isn't there anymore. And you see families say things that they always wanted to say but never found the way of saying, realize things that they hadn't previously realized, appreciate things that they hadn't previously appreciated, start rebuilding relationships, etc. That's the bit that I love.
Can imagine. And it takes so many forms, right?
Mm-hmm. Especially if you're lucky enough to support families around the world, is that, you can get some very British families for whom showing emotion is a very unnatural thing to do. And a sort of grunt and a nose blow to a British man can be the same as a hug and a smile from a more expressive person. So, as you say, it manifests itself very differently.
Yeah. I do realize that this is perhaps a difficult question, but I'll go there. I recently had the chance to go to a beautiful exhibit in the north of the Netherlands, and it was about the only Chinese empress that ever happened. And it was about her story and the legacy that she has left, being the only female leader. At the end of the exhibit, there were all of these red Chinese lanterns, and they had little metal hooks on it. And people who had come to the exhibit were invited to write on a tiny sheet of paper that asks you this question: how would you like to be remembered? And I thought, this is literally the question that we are sort of asking in our work and on this podcast. But the way it was put so simply, and there I was sort of just completely on my own with a pen writing this down for myself, and then I put it up. I'm not going to tell you on the show what I put there, but I'd love to know, if you were invited with this question, how would you like to be remembered? What would you jot down?
Well, I'm going to buy myself a little bit of time before I answer that question, because I thought you were going to ask me, when you talked about the Chinese empress, I thought you were going to say you've only talked about men so far. And I realize I've only talked about men so far, about Valentine Fleming, about Michael Fleming, about Valentine Fleming, my father. But that is because I was lucky enough to know the great women who were married to those men. And I understand more fully, I have a more complete picture about them. So please don't think that, when I say we stand on the shoulders of giants, those giants are all men. They're not. A lot of them are brilliant, strong, courageous women who had to carry the family whilst men went away and did what men did. And if we think about the values that really underpin successful intergenerational families, as often as not, it's been strong mothers, aunts, grandmothers, sisters who've been critical in that intergenerational success. And I've experienced it, and I'm grateful for it, and I recognize it. Okay, what was the question again? What do I want?
How would you like to be remembered, Matthew?
What would I write down of how I want to be remembered? So first of all, I don't want to be associated with, we're having this discussion with my mother about, do you want to be buried or not? I don't want to be buried. I want to be cremated, and I want to be sprinkled off the top of a mountain on the west coast of Scotland. I want to be, I don't need to be remembered in a place or with a thing or marked by I want to be remembered by everybody I've been lucky enough to touch in one way or another, whether it be soldiers I served with, whether it be cricketers I played with, families I've helped, or my own family. I'd like to be remembered as a good person who was a person of integrity, who loved and was loved, and for whom serving those people that he was lucky enough to work with or lead or be a father of or a grandfather of, that was what guided him.
I think that's a beautiful end. And if we were there in front of the lanterns, we would hang it up on the hook.
Yeah. That, of course, may not be how people remember me. They may say he was an absolute, but That's not what I want. I want people to remember me as being someone who generally had other people's best interests at heart.
I truly have enjoyed spending time with you today, and also your grandfather through the lens that you could share him. You're doing really good work. So thank you so much for sharing all of that.
Well, Jamie, it's a pleasure, and thank you for giving me the chance to chat about him a little bit more. Of course, being British, he would probably have thought that this whole thing was, nonsense, but you do such an interesting, your role in helping families talk about stuff is really important. And you realize how big a service you provide by helping idiots like me tell stories about people that they wish they could, chat to.
Yeah. My pleasure. My pleasure.
Cool.
More to come.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Who We Remember. If you enjoyed this, I invite you to subscribe. When you subscribe, a new episode will pop up automatically in your favorite listening platform every 2 weeks. You can see some great photos related to today's story, as well as find out more about our guests and their work. Just go to storykeep.com/podcast. Who We Remember is a production of StoryKeep. StoryKeep works with exceptional individuals and families to document their life stories and histories through films and private podcasts. You can learn more about our services at storykeep.com.